I wouldn't be much of a teacher if I didn't tell you that life is tough, and that everyone's looking out for themselves in this world. That's just the way it is, people. You know how I always say that biology is ultimately about sex and not dying? Well, both of those things are more difficult than we'd like them to be because of competition. There's a finite amount of resources on the planet, so evolution drives us to compete for them so that we can survive long enough to spread our genes all over the place. And naturally, competition is a really important part of how different species interact when their habitats overlap. These interactions between species are what define ecological communities. So it makes sense that community ecology studies these interactions anywhere they take place, from a tide pool to the whole ocean, from a rotting log to an entire forest. But just because interspecies interaction is mostly competitive doesn't necessarily mean that community ecology is all about big bloody tooth and claw scenes like from cable TV nature shows. Actually, a lot of it is, but we're not gonna get there until next week. For now, let's just note that competition, while prevalent and important, is also pretty dangerous, kind of a hassle, and can really hurt. So a lot of interspecies interaction is actually about sidestepping direct competition and instead finding ways to divvy up resources or otherwise let species just get along. Can you feel the love? Careful guys, because right now we are surrounded by potentially lethal interspecific competition going on all over the place. Since we're animals, we usually think of competition as going on between animals, but really it happens between almost all members of the four kingdoms of life. Whenever species compete, they're going after the same resources that they need for their survival and continued population growth. In this garden, the weeds are competing with the sunflower and the corn and the dill for the nutrients and water in the soil. So these resources, because they're finite in this area, are the limiting factors that we've talked about. The population can only get as big as these factors will allow. Now, a particularly nasty weed could, over time, eliminate the veggies entirely. Such elimination is known as competitive exclusion, and it's one of the most fundamental properties in community ecology and also, life. Because the fact is, when two species are competing for the same resources, one of them is eventually gonna be more successful and eliminate the other. This bitter truth is known as the competitive exclusion principle, and it was first identified in 1934 by Russian ecologist G.F. Gauss in a study of two closely related species of microscopic protists. When he was only 22 years old, Gauss made a name for himself by conducting experiments that pitted one species of protist, Paramecium aurelia, against another, Paramecium caudatum. First, Gauss grew each species separately with the exact same resources and found that each developed rapidly and established stable populations. But when he grew them in the same container, P. caudatum was soon driven to extinction by P. aurelia. Paramecium aurelia gained a competitive advantage because its population grew slightly faster than P. caudatum's. So Gauss's experiment showed that, in the absence of another disturbance, two species that require the same resources cannot live indefinitely in the same habitat. The inferior competitor will be eliminated. Makes sense? But if competitive exclusion is the natural law of the land, then why isn't all of Earth just a crazy crap circus of constant competition, predation, and ultimately extinction of all of those losers? Well, for a couple of reasons. First, not all resources are limiting. Two species of sharks may compete for water in the ocean, but the ocean is, gigantic, so that's not what limits their population growth. Rather, the amount of food, like a specific fish that they both eat, could be limiting, while other resources are plentiful. Second, as the overwhelming diversity of life in almost any community shows us, most species, even ones that are almost identical to each other, are adaptable enough to find a way to survive in the face of competition. There are also kinds of interspecies interaction where species actually join forces in the fight for survival. This is the ultimate in conflict avoidance. In these cases, species in a community actually manage to avoid competition altogether by forming downright tight relationships that benefit one, if not both, of the parties involved. You may have heard of both of these cases. First, mutualism, where both species benefit, and commensalism, where one species benefits and the other's kind of like whatever. Mutualism abounds in nature, and for those who've been paying attention to Crash Course, you've heard me talk about it many times before. A prime example are mycorrhiza, the fungal roots that we talked about a few weeks ago, where fungi and plant roots get entangled and essentially rub each other's backs for nutritious favors. Others you may have heard about include flowering plants that produce nectars to attract pollinators and that bear fruit to attract animals to help spread the seeds inside. Oftentimes these relationships become rather needy, like in the case of termites, termites, they can't break down the cellulose in the wood they eat without the enzymes produced by the microorganisms that live inside their digestive systems. Without the little critters, the bigger critters would die. Such a needy relationship is called obligate mutualism. By contrast, commensalism is where one species definitely benefits and the other isn't really hurt or helped. Such neutrality, of course, is difficult to prove because even a seemingly benign interaction probably has some effect. Barnacles, for example, hitchhike on gray whales, getting a free ride through swaths of plankton-rich water for feeding. While clearly a benefit to the barnacles, the relationship is often considered commensal because the whales probably don't really care whether the barnacles are there or not. Or do they? The barnacles might slow down the whale as it swims through the water, but on the other hand, they might also serve as a type of camouflage from predators like orcas, in which case they confer an advantage. So it probably comes down to meh for the whale, and when you consider all the other possibilities out there when species interact, meh isn't such a bad option. Of all the ways that species interact on this planet, maybe the one that fascinates us the most is predation. And why not? It's hard not to be captivated by, say, an Alaska brown bear, one of North America's apex predators, even though they get much of their nutrition from nuts and bugs and berries. But you can also tell that it's a pretty big fan of crushing the bones of other animals because of this amazingly pronounced sagittal crest, which is where its jaw muscles connect. And maybe part of why we're so fascinated by predation is because we are, in many ways, the planet's top predator. At least for now. That's how most of these guys got here, but for hundreds of thousands of years we were preyed upon as well, not just by bears and wolves, but by viruses and bacteria and parasites, because predation isn't just animal eats animal. Consider bison eating grass. That's a type of predation called herbivory, where an organism eats plants or algae to capture their energy. It may not really seem like predation to you, but bison eating grass, manatees eating seaweed, and sea urchins munching on algae are all examples of organisms eating other organisms to ingest the energy of the sun. There's also parasitism, another form of predation in which organisms derive energy from a host, usually harming it and sometimes killing it in the process. Hairworms, for example, devour the insides of grasshoppers and then brainwash them to make suicidal leaps into water. How exactly the waterborne worm finds its way into a grasshopper is a mystery, though larvae carried by mosquitoes is a likely route. Once inside the grasshopper, the worm eats everything non-essential to its host as it grows several times the length of its host's body. When only the grasshopper's head and legs remain, the hairworm is ready to reproduce. And that's when the brainwashing begins. See, hairworms breed in water, but grasshoppers can't swim. So hairworms pump their hosts full of chemicals that prompt an inescapable urge to leap into a body of water. Once the grasshopper makes the leap, the hairworm is free to burrow out of the host and find a mate. Ew. Yeah, chasing and eating a gazelle is one thing, but turning your prey into like a suicidal zombie, that, my friends, is predation. So clearly